franktalks.com.
Hi, this is Jenn Clamen from the Coalition for the Rights of Sex Workers, and you're listening to Frank Talks, Pleasures and Lifestyle.
You're listening to Frank Talks, Pleasures and Lifestyles, and I'm Frank because I have to be. In studio today we have Jenn Clamen, who is a representative of the Coalition of Sex Worker Rights. Welcome to studio, Jenn.
Thank you, hi.
Let's get right into the interview. What is the mission statement of the Coalition? What is the Coalition?
The Coalition for the Rights of Sex Workers is a group of male, female, transsexual, and transvestite sex workers who work towards recognizing sex work as work and fighting for sex workers' rights in general.
Can you tell me a little bit about the history of the Coalition, how and why it came to be?
Yeah, the Coalition was formed in 1996. There was a conference on sex work led by a bunch of academics at UQAM, and a bunch of sex workers decided at that time to start a group in defense of their own rights, to adjust certain rights because they were sort of tired of hearing people talk about sex work at the time. I wasn't there at the time, that's what I'm saying today. But they came together and they did, at that time, a bunch of very colorful actions, like go to the mayor's office and serve a spaghetti puttanesca and jumping out of a cake, and all these very visible actions to sort of let people know who sex workers were and why we deserve rights.
And prior to this particular conference, was it?
Yep.
Were the conferences a regular thing happening?
No, it was just a one-off, really.
So then
That's just how like what you'll find a lot of times is when there's conferences around sex work, a lot of sex workers will organize actions from the issues that came up, and one of the things that came up was we need a rights group for sex workers. At the time, there was already Stella, the organization for sex workers that existed, but I think the sex workers in Montreal realized that they needed more of a rights group that could be visible without risking any funding or anything like that.
I guess that brings me to my next question. Can you go into why it's necessary and or important to have this type of coalition in existence?
Yeah, it's a good cause. It's really important to recognize sex workers' rights as human rights, and that sex workers be recognized as citoyens, as citizens of our society. And a lot of the times, because of the stigma and discrimination associated around sex work, people forget that sex workers do have rights and that this is a job, and we need workers' rights in addition to that. So,
you had mentioned a little bit earlier about the organization called Stella.
Yes.
Can you give me just very briefly, for the benefit of our listeners, what is Stella and what relationship it has with the coalition, if any?
Okay, Stella is a member of the coalition. The coalition was actually born out of Stella at the beginning because it's a funded organization that provides services and defense work to enforce sex workers. It's run by sex workers, for sex workers. So it's basically, there's a drop-in and there's lots of services and lots of pamphlets and stuff and tools that come out of Stella to inform sex workers about what their rights are and how to work safely and with dignity. So it's not actually for male sex workers, so that's how the coalition differs. But Stella's a member, and they're always there to sort of support our actions and take part in it.
Now, you're an activist.
Yes.
What can you tell me about why you became an activist?
I hold these issues very dear to my heart, and for me, it's a lot of different reasons. I mean, mainly because it is a good cause, because it's important to recognize the marginalized groups in our society and what kind of rights certain people are denied. And I think that sex workers are denied, one of the most marginalized groups in society, especially on the street. And it's just really important to recognize those rights and fight for people to be a part of our actions, etc., or else we're not really being fair or just in any of our actions in the world if we're not recognizing that everybody deserves those. So that was my main motivation.
Let's turn our attention here to the law, specifically here in Canada.
Yeah, which is mainly what sort of propels the movement, the sex worker rights movement in general, and that's sex work is not actually illegal in Canada, but everything that you've got to do to work safely is communicating for the purposes of selling sex is illegal. It's illegal, pardon me, and living off your earnings is illegal. Everything you've got to do to sort of make sure you can work in safety is illegal. Even carrying condoms on the street can be used against you as evidence that you're a sex worker, even though legally that's not supposed to happen. It does happen. So the laws are set up to sort of deter people from sex working, but selling sex for money is actually not illegal in this country. They're quite ambiguous, the laws, in that sense, because you can sell sex for money, but you can't communicate to do it. You can't ask your neighbor to just look out for you to make sure nobody comes by, because that's illegal. You can't pay somebody $20 on the street to look out for you just to make sure that nobody causes any trouble, because that's illegal as well. So you're constantly running from the law because you're criminalized, but so that means you can't access the law, and that puts sex workers in a lot of danger, and it ensures that you cannot work legally in this country, really, as a sex worker. And so, we're seeking to abolish those laws and to repeal all of the laws that have to do with prostitution under the criminal code. And so what we're looking for is complete decriminalization of sex work, really.
I find it absolutely astonishing that the actual act of exchanging sex for money is not illegal.
Well, there's no victim in all of that, and I think that people, and that's why we say prostitution is a victimless crime, because it's between 2 or 3, even or 4 consenting adults, really,
right.
And there shouldn't be any discrimination against that. And it's funny because there's the people who do enforce the laws for prostitution, are called the morality squad, which I think is quite funny, and I always get a chuckle at that.
Mm-hmm.
But it for me, it highlights the fact that the laws are governed by a moral sense of justice and not by a reality necessarily.
By making everything surrounding sex work, by the promotion of it and whatnot, by making all of that illegal, I don't understand why they wouldn't simply make the exchange for sex for money illegal.
Well, changing the criminal code is quite a lengthy process. And when the laws came about, they were sort of protectionist in the sense that they were meant to protect people. They were meant to protect minors. They were meant to protect people from in gambling situations. Where there was a lot of prostitution, and so who it was meant to protect is really uncertain at this point, because there are laws that say you can't coerce people into There's the procuring law that you can't tell people where to work or how to work, and that's sort of known as the pimping law. But really what that is it doesn't protect you against coercion. There are laws that do protect you against coercion that have nothing to do with prostitution laws, but it does prevent prevents me from telling somebody where they could work that's safe for them, or giving them advice on how to work or how to have a business plan for work. So those things that you need, which I would consider occupational health and safety standards, or standards for, like, guidelines for work practice, are actually illegal to do. Changing the law to make sex work illegal would be to make the act of sex for money illegal would be taking about 1,500 steps backward. I think so. What we're looking to do is make it all not legal, but just okay, we're trying to legitimize the trade.
You had mentioned earlier in this particular conversation that someone carrying condoms could be used against them.
Mm-hmm. This is why it's problematic, the laws, because they're problematic for your physical safety and for your mental safety, but also, your physical safety in the sense of HIV prevention, because if you're caught with too many condoms on you, if you're crossing the border with too many condoms on you, you're questioned. If you're on the street with too many condoms on you, you're questioned. When really that's ridiculous. But the cops will take advantage of that if they want. They can't actually use that as evidence, but they can use that to interrogate you and to instill you with fear into admitting that you were communicating for the purposes of selling sex.
Let's go a little bit deeper here. You had mentioned the word decriminalization. Mm-hmm. And is there a difference between decriminalization and it being legal?
Mm-hmm. There's a massive difference. Legalization is when, we see legalization as a way for the state to have more control over sex work activity, for them to decide how and when it's going to take place. I like to liken those particular words just to the argument of decriminalizing pot. It's a very different sort of domain, but in terms of the legal jargon. We can make similarities here, and that's people don't want pot to be legalized because they don't want it to be governed by the state, so the state can determine how much you can have and where you can get it, etc. But rather, they want it to be legitimized the same way that cigarettes are, where they can buy it and sell it, etc. And decriminalization would mean that sex workers would not be criminalized. We would take all the codes out of the criminal code that pertain to prostitution, and it would involve some kind of regulation the way any other commercial industry does, but it would not be governed by the state per se. You could have an association of sex workers the same way there's an association of psychologists. That would govern the way that their work would function. So there's a massive difference. I mean, and what you find in a lot of legalized situations, like the Nevada brothels, for example, is that there's mandatory testing of prostitutes, which is completely unsafe because it makes sure that the clients, it ensures that the sex workers are tested but the clients are not, and you're only as safe as your next client. It also sort of promotes this notion of sex workers as vehicles for HIV, and it doesn't really address the issue of sex education and the fact that, safe sex needs to be practiced by everybody, not just by sex workers who really are practicing more safe sex than anybody else. So there's a big difference. There's a huge difference between legalization. That's why the sex worker rights movement in particular is fighting for decriminalization of the sex trade in all countries around the world.
What would you say is the biggest benefit of decriminalization, and what would you say would be the biggest fear if it was run by the government?
I would say the biggest benefit of decriminalization would be that sex workers could stop running from the police, and that what that would mean is that sex workers have equal access to the law, because you don't have equal access to the law when you're criminalized, because no matter what, even if you are a victim of a crime, you end up having your background checked, and then if they realize that you are a criminal as well, then you get treated as a criminal, not a victim of a crime. And that happens a lot with sex workers with regards to violence on the street. They aren't listened to by the police, and they have to be running from the police, and they're getting into situations that are more dangerous. And they can't report things to the police that you normally would, and people take advantage that the law is ambiguous. And that's I think it's important to note that the violence is a result of the ambiguous laws, not a result of the work itself. So having sex in itself isn't a violent act unless it's done in a violent way, unless people are taking advantage of that situation. That's what people tend to do about the laws. And in a legalized system, what our fear would be is that sex workers would be governed, would be owned and governed by the state, and which would mean the state, who's never worked in the industry before, would govern how the industry works, and so it wouldn't necessarily fulfill or sort of address the needs of sex workers and their realities of work and life.
From the way you're describing it, and if I'm wrong on this, please correct me, it sounds like the majority of the laws that exist that affect sex workers aren't really there to protect the sex worker.
I agree. I mean, a lot of them are a lot of policies are supposed to. I mean, they're instilled to protect the sex worker, but when you look at protectionist policies and policies that are meant to protect people, it usually governs the actions of that person. The procuring law is a good example, because it's meant so that somebody cannot make you work in the industry, so they cannot sort of invite you to work into the industry. But what that law really is so that you cannot be inviting people. You cannot necessarily be giving tips on how. Like, I can't say to someone, "Come work with me. I work at a good place," because I'd be considered to be procuring. It doesn't protect that person against coercion. There are already coercion laws that exist. It's just a matter of application. And what we find with sex work laws is that they're applied very ambiguously, and depending on what the greater community's needs are. For example, in the summer, when you see a lot of festivals in the city, you'll see the cops really trying to clean the streets, putting a lot of the sex workers in jail. And that's what happens every summer. It's happened this summer again, is a lot of sex workers are finding themselves in jail because the police are under an enormous pressure to clean up, and then I say this in quotes, to clean up the streets.
So
like the laws aren't necessarily being used for escorts, because when people can't see it, it's sort of this not in my backyard attitude, and people can't see it, they're not necessarily fighting too hard to make it go away.
So it sounds like even though the laws exist 24/7 every day of the year, the only time they're enforced is when the government or society around it has a particular reason to use these.
And whether or not that reason is justified. I mean, it's not justified to clean up the streets. It's not justified to put all the sex workers in jail. It's not justified to raid a brothel or to raid a massage parlor, to raid anything, really. I mean, none of that is justified if the act itself it shouldn't be considered criminal. But because people have moral issues around sex work and selling sex in general, you find that, I mean, the police will apply those laws more irrationally, I would say.
Before we go to break, there's one more question, and this is to elaborate on what we've been discussing. What are some of the dangers that sex workers face that the Coalition recognizes, whether they be violent or non-violent? Because if the law is not there to protect the sex worker, what are the dangers they face?
I mean, one of the obvious ones is violence, because the law is not there to protect you, and people take advantage of that. A very good example would be Gary Ridgway in Seattle, Washington, 2 years ago, murdered over 30 sex workers. And he was quoted saying, "I killed them because they were prostitutes, because I knew that nobody would look after them and nobody would care if they were gone, and so nobody would ever find me." I mean, thank God he was wrong in the end of all that. He was found. But he killed them because they were prostitutes. And so that, that is what happens. But there's other things that happen, too, in terms of just occupational health and safety violations. Like at work, you cannot count on having your rights, respected. You cannot ensure that your workplace is clean, or that you're going to get your pay all the time, depending on where you work, or that you're going to be able to get a T4 slip at the end so that you can file your taxes. There's a whole range of dangers. Dangers or injustices, I would call them. I wouldn't call them necessarily dangers. Yeah, I would more call them injustice that sex workers face because the trade itself is not considered legitimate.
You're listening to Frank Talks Pleasures and Lifestyles, and we'll be back right after this.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by the Calibrated Storytelling Seminar. Have you ever felt tongue-tied when talking to a woman and did not know what to say next? This seminar provides the structure to create personalized stories that connect to a woman's emotional needs. Calibration is about putting people into the categories and then modifying your behavior. Do you want to learn how to be truthful about who you are, but in an interesting and seductive way? If you want women to like you for the real you, then this seminar is for you. The Calibrated Storytelling Seminars and telephone consultations, only available at franktalks.com.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by the book I'm a Man, That's My Job, The Philosophy of a Seducer. Ladies, have you ever wondered where all the real men have gone? Do you turn to your women friends because you cannot find a true man in your life? Do you want the man in your life to step up and know what it means to be a man that can make you feel like the woman that you are? Are you tired of mothering the men you date? Give these boys the gift of manhood. The book, I'm a Man, That's My Job, teaches men to create their own seduction persona, personal inner game, and how to take the lead in a relationship. Buy this book now at franktalks.com. Frank Talks is sponsored in part by Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test, a man's guide to the emotional needs of women. Ladies, do you want the man in your life to understand you on your level? Do you want your man to be able to listen to and address all of your emotional needs? Show him how much you really want your relationship to be the best it can be. Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test makes a perfect gift. The book, written by a man, for men, is endorsed by every woman that reads it. This book is a guide for men to understand exactly what a woman means when she speaks. Is that worth changing your life forever? Buy this book at franktalks.com now.
You're listening to Frank Talks Pleasures and Lifestyles, and I'm Frank because I have to be. In studio today with Jenn Clamen of the Coalition of Sex Worker Rights. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you.
Let's continue on with this wonderful interview. The first question I want to ask you in this segment is, what are the specific laws on the books as they relate to sex workers that you think are most important to note?
The four criminal codes that we usually fight, we're working to repeal, are codes 210 through 213. One is, 210 is finding yourself in a maison de debauche, in like what's known as a brothel, 211 is transporting somebody to a brothel, so that includes chauffeur service, etc. The other is sort of introducing somebody into the trade, which is 212, and 213 is the most common one that people are charged with, and that's communicating for the purposes of selling sex. I mean, there's also other laws that are used, like indecency laws, or, I mean, a lot of sex workers on the street are charged with flanage. It's loitering or jaywalking or anything, really, things that most people in the city don't get charged with. But
now, there is a stigma attached to the idea of being a sex worker, and I'd like your thoughts on why you think that stigma exists.
Yeah. I think people have issues around, they have a hard time stomaching the idea of sex for money. They have a hard time stomaching the idea of sex with strangers. A lot of that is rooted in our sexual beliefs and our sexual conservatism, which I tend to think Canada is widespread for. I think people they have a hard time understanding. I mean, it's funny because you see things like on the Oprah show, you see like Oprah having someone who'll come and teach pole dancing so that you can do pole dancing for you and your lover. But the second you actually are a dancer and an exotic dancer in a club, you become a whore, because then you're taking it too seriously. So while we are in this culture of encouraging a more open sexuality within a monogamous couple situation, the idea of having sex with more than one person, having sex with multiple partners, fantasy, all of those ideas are still pretty shunned, and you'll find those communities in general are fairly underground. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done around sexuality. There's a lot of education that needs to be done around why people are working, and that's sort of what we also tend to do is, the concept of work and how sex work is a way for a lot of people to have an income. If they're students, if they're drug users, if they don't have other options, or even if they have tons of options. So it's as widespread. I mean, there's as many reasons for sex working as there are for taking other jobs. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done around that.
Next question. Obviously, your organization is fighting for the idea that sex work should be considered as legitimate as any other job. My question to you is, given the stigma, given the problems that people have with sex in general and their attitudes towards sex, why should sex work be considered as legitimate as another job?
Well, the fact is that there are a lot of people doing it. I mean, it doesn't matter if you would do it. It matters that you have to respect the people that are doing it. And so for people who are doing it, for people who do consider it a legitimate job, it needs to be considered that. I mean, it exists, and it is a huge industry, and if you can't just ignore the fact that it's going on, and you need to make sure, we all need to make sure that people in the industry have those rights. And for that reason alone, it should be legitimized, but also because it is a service for remuneration, and I mean, just by virtue of the fact of what it is, it should be considered legitimate. Aside from the fact that legitimizing it will allow sex workers to have the same rights as other workers. I mean, it's happening, and we need to sort of just accord sex workers those same rights. It makes perfect sense.
Let's talk a little bit about the sex workers in question. For the benefit of our listeners, maybe some of them have hired sex workers in their past, and let's aim this answer towards the people who maybe don't even know if they've ever met a sex worker. Let's get into some of the stats here on sex workers. Who are they? What percentage of them are male? What percentage do you think are transgendered? Anything, and if you don't have stats available...
I don't have stats. I can tell you that probably about less than 10% of the industry is male. About 10% of the industry are street workers. I don't really have, to be honest, an average. Like, I could say most people between the ages of 20 and 38. Again, it varies. Like, it's a very varied industry, but depending on what the needs are.
Maybe can I ask you some questions about some of the sex workers that you've come into contact with in your role as an activist?
Yeah.
How many of them were transgendered?
I mean, a lot. It depends what kind of action you're doing, but there are a lot of transgender sex workers, mainly M to X working. Yeah, I mean, how many? It's hard to say. I would say less than 10% again, but it might be as small as 3%. Those stats aren't exactly something I can offer up.
Okay.
But the majority of the industry is women working, because that's sort of what. Well, yeah.
Okay. We're looking at here stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the stereotype of a sex worker is usually a woman who's either not very smart or in a very desperate situation, usually controlled by a pimp, a man who's managing all of her money and she doesn't get a cent. I'd like to know, based on your experience as an activist and with the sex workers that you have met and fighting for their rights, which of these stereotypes are true and what part of the stereotypes are myths?
I mean, yes, everyone thinks that sex workers are all on drugs and are uneducated, etc., and have been abused when they were younger. And of course, you will find some people who do fit that stereotype, but I can't say that the majority of people do. I think that you'll find people who've been sexually assaulted or sexually abused in their childhood in all types of jobs, as much as you'll find people who do drugs in all types of jobs. It's just that a lot of people assume that most sex workers adhere to that stereotype, and they don't. I mean, it's very varied. Some people use drugs, some people don't. Some people use drugs recreationally, and I think, look at the student population of how many people use drugs recreationally. So it's really important to know that most sex workers, a lot of sex workers don't adhere to that stereotype, and it's important to not assume that there's one reason for somebody entering into the sex trade or working the sex trade. So, yeah.
Let's talk about the different types of sex workers.
Okay.
You have people working on sex phone lines.
Yeah, you've got people working in domination, people working on the phone lines, people working as escorts in massage parlors, as dancers, on the street, in brothels, online work, pornography.
Well, you talked about dominatrix.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's my question. BDSM dominatrix, who is hired to help satisfy a client fetish, may not necessarily involve sex.
That's right.
For example, somebody might get off on being made to act like a slave and scrub the kitchen floor. Although that provides some sexual satisfaction for the client, it's not sex.
No.
But it is not defined as sex. Would that still be considered sex work?
Yeah, because the person who's normally providing that service will be having sex sometimes, and so a lot of the times they'll consider themselves. They'll say I'm a dominatrix. They might not say I'm a sex worker, but domination is, it is related to sex and sexual pleasure, and so you still are selling a sexual service.
Even if there's no act of penetration, if there's no...
it is all for the purposes of getting a hard-on for the client, or all for the purposes of sexual pleasure. Wrapped up in a lot of issues, not issues, but a lot of other
fetishes
and intentions, etc. But it's definitely...
Doesn't this sound like thought control almost?
It is that as well, but most people who are offering that service will come across a client who does want to have anal penetration, for example, or some sort of nipple clamps, or some sort of sexual endeavor, really. At some point it does usually involve something to do with sex, even if there's no penetration. It's about sort of stepping outside of the box about how you define sex, I think. Not you, but people.
No, I've decided that I'm going to step in and I'm going to dictate everything.
There you go.
And it all begins at the radio show, man.
There you go.
Today the radio show, tomorrow I control the world.
Done.
You've worked with a lot of sex workers as an activist, counseling them.
I don't counsel, no. But yeah, I work with. I'm always around sex workers. Yeah.
Okay. I guess my question to you is, what are your insights to the lifestyle of a sex worker, what they face on a day-to-day basis?
There's a lot of things that you've got to do in terms of hiding your identity. A lot of people have double identities. They live with, they're not out to their families or their friends. A lot of bureaucracy to deal with because you're really scared to sort of out yourself at anything, at your bank, at your school. If you've got kids, you don't want to out yourself to your kids, because then if the parent-teacher meetings, everybody knows you're a sex worker, you usually be shunned, you can get your kids taken away from you. There's a lot of secrecy and isolation involved in the work, mainly because it's not accepted. Aside from the stigma and the discrimination you face if people do know you're working. So there's a lot of sort of imposed shame that sex workers feel, so we try to sort of create as much of a community as we can for everybody. Those are the main day-to-day issues. I mean, when you're working, the issues of physical and sexual health are issues, and sort of that's obviously part of your job to ensure that both of those are maintained positively. And does that give you an idea?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like a very pleasant day-to-day existence.
It is actually. No, it is pleasant. I mean, you kind of. I think that everybody has a little jardin secret anyways. Like, everyone has their little secrets, and you don't have to live in secrecy. I think the job itself is quite enjoyable if you enjoy. If it's something you've chosen to do and you like it. It's just in terms of interacting with the world at large about it is a quite difficult thing to do. So if you don't do that, then you're actually okay. I think a lot of people get used to and accustomed to people not knowing, and the discretion that involves, and that doesn't offend everybody. I think it's not everybody that needs to talk about what they did today, or everybody that, and you do. I mean, it's not like every sex worker is silent. We've got a sex workers community, so you can talk about it in that community. A lot of sex workers' friends do know, or their families do know. Those are some of the challenges of being a sex worker. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that was the lifestyle of a sex worker, but that's the challenges of being a sex worker. The lifestyle of a sex worker would be quite similar to the lifestyle of anybody else. You wake up, you grab your coffee, and you do your laundry, and then you go see a client. So it's quite similar. It's just, you go to work, either in the morning or in the afternoon or at night for a couple hours or 5 hours, or you do a 24-hour shift, whatever. But the lifestyle is quite. Your schedule is quite different. It's not a 9-to-5 job necessarily, but yeah. Sorry, thank you for pointing that out, because those were the challenges that I were mentioning, not the lifestyle in general.
Fair enough. I don't know if you can answer this next question, because we definitely don't want to be breaking any laws ourselves here.
Mm-hmm.
But my next question is, how easy is it to get into the sex trade, and how difficult is it to get out of the sex trade?
Should be pretty easy. I mean, people can just go and sort of look into it. I mean, it's very accessible, the sex trade. How easy is it to get out? It's pretty easy too. It's, in terms of just planning, I think any sort of job change is difficult if you haven't planned in advance how to do it. Like, if you're going to quit your job, for example, have you made sure to save enough money? Have you stayed on top of your game that way? And so the way you transition out of any job is you need to keep in mind when you're transitioning out of sex work. But I would say in or out, I mean, not so difficult.
Last question before we go to our next break. How do you respond to the criticism that sex work is not really work?
I respond by saying it's probably said by somebody who's never worked before. If the people who said that would actually just go to one client, they would see how much work is involved in terms of the negotiation that you must do with your client, the money management, the relationship between you and your client, or you and your boss. In terms of just services that you offer to your client, the way anytime you offer any service to anybody of any sort, you need to sort of be keeping in mind, like, is the client pleased? Are you, setting your own boundaries quite clearly? Is the client expressing his or her boundaries? So it's a big negotiation process, and it is quite exhausting. It is a lot of work. That comes easy to some and harder to others, obviously. But I think people need to understand what's involved in it. So it is a myth that sex workers just lie on their backs. And in fact, sex is a very minimal part of the job. There's a lot of negotiation, like I mentioned, but it's also a lot of talking with the client and seeing what the client needs. And a lot of the time, clients just need to talk. And that doesn't mean that sex isn't involved, but there's a lot of sort of appeasing the clients and making sure they're okay, and a lot of chat that comes with that. So it definitely is work. And a lot of people say it's akin to counseling, really, because there's a service that you're providing someone that person needs, that's satisfying a lot of their desires at the time. So
great.
Yeah.
You're listening to Frank Talks Pleasures and Lifestyles. We'll be back right after this.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test, a man's guide to the emotional needs of women. Ladies, do you want the man in your life to understand you on your level? Do you want your man to be able to listen to and address all of your emotional needs? Show him how much you really want your relationship to be the best it can be. Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test makes a perfect gift. The book, written by a man, for men, is endorsed by every woman that reads it. This book is a guide for men to understand exactly what a woman means when she speaks. Is that worth changing your life forever? Buy this book at franktalks.com now.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by the Calibrated Storytelling Seminar. Have you ever felt tongue-tied when talking to a woman and did not know what to say next? This seminar provides the structure to create personalized stories that connect to a woman's emotional needs. Calibration is about putting people into the categories and then modifying your behavior. Do you want to learn how to be truthful about who you are, but in an interesting and seductive way? If you want women to like you for the real you, then this seminar is for you. The Calibrated Storytelling Seminars and telephone consultations, only available at franktalks.com.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by the book, I'm a Man, That's My Job, The Philosophy of a Seducer. Ladies, have you ever wondered where all the real men have gone? Do you turn to your women friends because you cannot find a true man in your life? Do you want the man in your life to step up and know what it means to be a man that can make you feel like the woman that you are? Are you tired of mothering the men you date? Give these boys the gift of manhood. The book, I'm a Man, That's My Job, teaches men to create their own seduction persona, personal inner game, and how to take the lead in a relationship. Buy this book now at franktalks.com.
You're listening to Frank Talks Pleasures and Lifestyles, and I'm Frank because I have to be. We're in studio for our third and final segment with Jenn Clamen from the Coalition for Sex Worker Rights. Jen, how are you doing?
I'm good.
All right, let's tackle on a few more questions. All right, what can you tell me about the men who work as sex workers and what capacity of their clients are, men or women? Anything that you may shed some light.
Most of the men working in the industry are servicing male clients, so it's a lot of it's happening in the gay community. There are a few men who are servicing women, but it's very rare, mainly because women aren't necessarily encouraged to ask for sex or to buy sex or to express their sexual desires. So there's not a culture of demanding sex in women's culture, so there's not as much of a market for it, unfortunately. Because I think a lot of people would enjoy it. Yeah.
Do you think that men experience different challenges as sex workers than women do?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, for men, I know it's really hard. Sometimes you've got to keep it hard. Like, it's a really big challenge. I would say that's one of the challenges. In terms of the stigma, that's also. I mean, stigma, etc., is as big of a challenge. Finding clientele if you're servicing women would be one of the challenges. But legitimizing in general the trade of the laws are quite a challenge as well. I have to say the men aren't affected as much by the laws necessarily because they're not applied so much to the men. Because again, there's a culture around men having sex as more accepted. So
they're not stigmatized by the law as often as women.
Not as stigmatized as much, but the law does apply. It just isn't necessarily applied. It applies. It
applies, but it's not applied.
Yes.
What can you tell me about women clients? I mean, do you think that if sex was a little bit more accepted in our society, there would be more women clients?
If it was accepted, yeah, I definitely think so, for sure. I mean, a lot of women go to strip clubs and they giggle and they laugh when they do it, but they're going. But they're going as a joke. I mean, but when men go to strip clubs, they're going and they're very serious about it. They're going to actually see naked women, and so there's it's kind of silly for women to be asking for sex, and it's kind of like hee. But men, it's okay for them to be doing it, and I think that's sort of one of the problems with the industry is that it's not necessarily égal because of that. Like it's not equal. But I mean, I think there is a market for it. But I mean, also one of the problems is women are making a lot less money than men, so they don't necessarily have the income to pay for sex workers to visit them.
I once interviewed a professional escort, and she talked about our society as a touch-starved society.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like any thoughts you may have on that.
Yeah, I think that sort of, I think that sort of it goes into what I was saying about the acceptance of sex and sexuality and having multiple partners and not even just multiple partners, but understanding your sexuality a little bit more as something other than the missionary position, as something other than a task, but something that can be enjoyed and explored. And I wouldn't necessarily say that's how I'd describe it, touch-starved, but I would say that one of the reasons the industry exists is because one of the great things about the industry is that it responds to a need for people to be able to explore their sexuality and to explore their needs and their fantasies, etc. So,
can you tell me if you have any knowledge about the international legal status of sex work? Are there countries where sex work is perfectly legal, and how does that affect their immediate society?
Yeah, there's one model of law around prostitution that we sort of aim towards, and that's the New Zealand model, which is in New Zealand in 2003, sex work was decriminalized. And that decriminalization model is something we aim towards. It's not perfect, but more or less it's what we're looking for. In the USA, everything is completely illegal. So, there's tons and tons and tons of repression and a lot of secrecy around the industry. Countries like Amsterdam, you've got a legalized system where people can work in brothels, they can work in windows, etc. Countries like Sweden, it's only the clients that are criminalized, and so the sex workers are okay to work, but the clients aren't allowed to buy sex, which is really brutal too, because once you criminalize the clients, you're also criminalizing the sex workers. In Germany, they have legalized sex work. In Japan, vaginal sex actually isn't illegal. Vaginal sex is illegal, but anal sex isn't illegal. It's okay to have anal sex, but it's not okay to have vaginal sex, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
In Japan. The laws vary, but the only decriminalized system that we see is in New Zealand. And that's the model we're sort of aiming towards.
When regulating sexuality, where will the lines be drawn, do you think?
I think that people have a hard time regulating the sex trade, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think that people will have a hard time around the health and safety issue. I think people are really panicked that sex workers are giving everybody HIV. That isn't the case, and we know that from research, from realities, but I think people are panicked around that. So I think what tends to happen is sex workers are mandated to use condoms or mandated for HIV tests. It's very dangerous to do that because it lends the impression that sex workers are the only ones who are at risk of HIV. It also gives the client the impression that it's okay to have sex without a condom. So it's dangerous to do that, but I think people have a hard time getting around that. I think also regulating it, the lines are definitely going to be drawn age. I think the under 18 thing will still remain. Around where brothels can be placed, don't place it next to a church, don't place it next to a young school, etc. So I think people will still want to hide it a little bit, but generally, yeah.
That brings me to my next question. And I'm just going to paint a scenario here of what the future could hold should sex work be either decriminalized or maybe legalized. Does that mean that one day children can grow up wanting to be a sex worker and it won't be discouraged? And that concept, thrown out today could cause a lot of anger.
I know, but children already grow up wanting to be hookers. I mean, come on. Halloween, wasn't everybody a hooker for Halloween? When they were younger?
Well, I know I was.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
But you see, people grow up wanting to be sexual, wanting to be free sexually. That is already happening. Thank God that's happening. Understanding, not wanting to be a sex worker, but or maybe wanting to be a dancer, but understanding that sexuality is okay. I don't think that that's ever going to be a reality for anybody in this world where sex is just okay all the time. I think that there's a lot of conservative people who won't be okay with sex. So they will be discouraged not to have sex, much less be a sex worker.
So you don't think that there are kids that, although we want to encourage them, if I understand this correctly, to be comfortable with their sexuality. You don't think that by decriminalizing...
I think it'll help. Yeah, I think it will help. But we're talking about generations and generations away, like of people who.
So this won't happen by the time our grandkids are around.
I don't think so, because by that time, but you've got to also consider who's in government by that time. Once you get a conservative government, and then all your work is gone.
Let's take this interview home. I'd like for you to talk about the sacrifices that you have to make as an activist for sex workers.
The sacrifices?
If any.
Sometimes there's just the same. I mean, people either know if you're not out as a sex worker, people assume that you are a sex worker, and so you have to deal with what that is anyways. You have to deal with the stigma of that anyhow. If you are out, you deal with it anyways as a sex worker on a daily, whenever. But it's hard because people don't necessarily believe, they don't want to take what you're saying seriously, and you're representing and you're a part of a minority.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really difficult. It's frustrating to get your point across, and it's hurtful to get your point across because there are people that come up against you. You're also considered really marginal, like being an activist in general is quite a taboo thing to do. Not in Montreal per se, but in other provinces. So,
what are some of the ways that sex workers can improve their images?
Can improve their images?
Uh-huh.
I think it's more for the population at large to improve their perception, and what a lot of sex workers are doing for that. The burden has been placed on sex workers to do a lot of education around what the realities of sex work are and what they aren't, in particular. So, yeah.
What would you say is the biggest positive benefit that you've personally experienced with your association as an activist?
Within the coalition?
Uh-huh.
I've met some fantastic people, and I've learned to... I've been challenged in a lot of ways on my own stereotypes and my own belief systems, and the people I've met are just beautiful, colorful, intense people. They're wonderful. And a lot of people, in the activist communities can just broaden your understanding of life in general. So,
if someone wanted to get in contact with the coalition, where would they start?
You can go on our website. It's La Coalition Montreal, all one word, .com. You can call us at 859-9009. I think that's the number, 859-9009, or you can email us at lacoalition2000@yahoo.com.
And the area code?
It's 514, pardon me.
514.
In Montreal.
All right. And future aspirations of the coalition?
Just to keep on being visible, really. We're in the process of writing a manifesto right now. But to really just keep being visible and keep working towards sex workers' rights in general, and to make sure that people keep listening to us, at least sort of paying attention, and eventually we will break through and be a part of the world's biggest change towards decriminalization in the industry, we hope.
Jen, it's been absolutely wonderful having you on the show.
Thank you, Frank.
And we have a parting gift for you.
Oh!
It is a bottle of sparkling water.
Wow, thank you.
And we're going to make sure that you get that with an edited copy of this show.
Super.
So we definitely look forward to inviting you back here on Frank Talks.
That's good. I look forward to it as well.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test, a man's guide to the emotional needs of women. Ladies, do you want the man in your life to understand you on your level? Do you want your man to be able to listen to and address all of your emotional needs? Show him how much you really want your relationship to be the best it can be. Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test makes the perfect gift. The book, written by a man, for men, is endorsed by every woman that reads it. This book is a guide for men to understand exactly what a woman means when she speaks. Is that worth changing your life forever? Buy this book at franktalks.com now.
Need help with love, sex, dating, and relationship issues? Help from Frank Kermit, the best-selling author and Canada's most international relationship coach, is only a click away. at franktalks.com. Coaching available in person, by phone, and by Skype. For singles, couples, and alternative lifestyles, franktalks.com.
Need help with love, sex, dating and relationships? Visit franktalks.com.
What do you do when you feel like a fool? When your heart has been broken again? Pick up the phone or get onto Skype and talk on a private session. Yeah, get a little help from Frank Talks. Whoa, whoa, get by with a little help from Frank Talks. You gotta try a little help from Frank Talks. What do you do when your love goes away? Try coaching one-on-one. How do I sign up to turn things around? Just sign up at franktalks.com. Yeah, get by with help from Frank Talks. I get by with little help from Frank Talks. Time to try a little help from Frank Talks. Doesn't cost a lot of money. It's the best rate going around. But it costs a lot of money. Oh, it's worth every cent that you will put down. Yeah. franktalks.com. Oh, you got to go to get your help from franktalks.com. Yeah, yeah. franktalks.com. Would you believe that Frank gets results? Yes, we're certain. Just read the reviews. Frank knows his stuff, and Frank's got real goods. Good love can soon come to you.